Hello and welcome to News 9. You're watching the weekend edition of Business Plus. I'm Karthik Malhotra. Power pack 25 minutes or so where we look at the top 3 headlines that really dominated all the newspapers and all the news coverage in the world of business and economy last week. Let's look at the headlines. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman backs RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das on loan tightening. What will it mean for consumption? Deepfake, a new threat to democracy, says IT Minister Ashwani Vaishnaw, and lays out his plan for tackling deepfake. And go first, is it a short runway to recovery or pretty much the end of the runway? These are the 3 stories lined up for you on the weekend edition of Business Plus. Joining me as usual in the studio is the editor of News9 Mediaverse, Rakesh Kar.
Hi
Rakesh. Thank you for joining us this weekend. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay, 3 big stories, Rakesh. Let's start straight with what's happening in the world of banking.
It's been a very busy week for the business, genre. A lot of stories happening. I think you picked the right 3 stories because they have deep impact on the society at large, I guess.
Yeah.
To begin with the first story, the tightening of the loans by both RBI and the FM being in sync, which again is a happy sign at the face of it, but has deeper repercussions on the entire consumption story.
Okay.
The whole world is talking about India's consumption story being the key lever for the growth that the world is looking at India as, as an Indian destination. If you bring in some checks and balances, I'm using that word cautiously, on consumption, it will have both a macro and a micro impact on the Indian economy.
Okay.
Now, is the threat real? I guess it is. I have personally been very worried about this. We did discuss this briefly in our earlier editions when we did point out that this great urge of the Indian, this upwardly mobile, class which is seeking to take the next big step by leveraging the debt economy. So in that sense, that's a very healthy sign for consumption, but if it's not adequately secured at the back end, that has strong consequences both for the banking system, which is just about recovering from several shocks that we know all about, and also for the the individual who is taking those loans, because if it's not all tied up, I'm saying in the sense of all being secured, there are going to be repercussions on that. So in that, so there are worry signs, but in the short term, even if consumption takes a little bit of hit, I think it's the right step in the right direction.
So let's take one step back, Rakesh, and really understand where this issue really emerged from. I think there were personal loans being dished out, people making large-scale purchases on credit cards, converting those into EMIs, and these are typically the kind of loans that don't have a collateral attached to them. So what the RBI really did was it increased or assigned a higher risk weightage, increasing it by about 25% and asking banks to park more money aside to provision for bad debts. Now, the worry on the other side of the table is that if easy access to loans is thwarted, then are we going to continue seeing the kind of consumption boom that we've seen?
As I pointed out, I think it's a double-edged sword, but if you don't take the first step, the second step, could lead to many more consequences, which may not be on the face of it right now. I'll explain. See, if you don't bring in checks and balances on unsecured loans, and taking personal loans in COVID and taking personal loans post-COVID when the economy is really doing well, they are 2 different genres.
Needs versus wants.
Needs versus wants. Absolutely, you put it very brightly. Needs versus wants, and there's no end to wants. So aspiration and ambition is the defining line from the consumer point of view. I think there is need for a societal checkup in terms of what you want at what stage of life, in terms of fast-tracking your growth as an individual from a peer group perspective is something that we have to be really, really cognizant of. I'm happy that RBI has brought in this, condition of putting greater weightage on personal loans. At the same time, I think, they have to go case by case in terms of which banks. There is a deeper need for a greater audit in terms of where is the problem, if at all there is a problem.
So I think the problem was perhaps more in foresight rather than hindsight, where the understanding was that because this category of unsecured loans is ballooning, the chances of default, the probability being the same, but the volume of default may in fact reach a point where banks are unable to sustain. However, I think, a fundamental question that needs to be answered is that you can perhaps look at other checks and balances rather than increasing the risk weights. So by ensuring at least that you're not really thwarting the loan cycle, maybe better KYC so that you can go after the defaulters better?
Well, I think on KYC, a lot of tightening has happened. I wouldn't say that no work has happened on that front. And also the consumers are themselves very, very conscious about going in for the KYC landscape. Of course, improving that at the micro and the macro level is welcome. But I think the bigger issue is that, what kind of quantum in terms of loan is being given. India has traditionally been extremely conservative about that.
Yeah.
If you look at global economies, if your salary is X, you won't get X into 5 loan. You will get X by 5 loan. So long as that maxim is adhered to, I don't think the problem size is too large. But yes, they have identified the problem in terms of raising the risk for this galloping appetite for taking loans without probably being always able to secure it.
Right.
So you have to link it to the larger economic growth story and also the employment data.
Right.
Because I don't have the demographic profile of all those who are taking these personal loans, but my sense, Karthik, is that they would generally be the 20 to 35 age group who are first-time jobbers. They want to buy the first car, the first iPhone, and that quest to do the first is something that's where I think we need to put arrest that. That taking the escalator.
So what is going to happen now? To your mind, what seems to be the next step? Are we going to see banks increasing the interest rate at which they lend these unsecured loans? That seems like a very, very obvious thing for banks to do. Or are we going to see banks maybe keeping rates constant but refraining from lending unsecured loans to
Karthik,
customers?
I don't think it's a great idea to further increase the rates, because that will have a cascading effect on the overall economy. Bringing in greater checks and balances for that particular individual, both in terms of the weightage for that kind of loan and also, maybe better KYC identification or profiling. I'm using that word because it's important to see who the gentleman is or who the person is, what is his CIBIL score. A CIBIL score for a housing loan is a must. I think a CIBIL score or an equivalent for
any
every
credit
loan
worthiness
should be measured and should be enforced.
Right. Okay, let's look at what Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had to say, and let's pull up that quote. And primarily what Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said late last week was around the fact that maybe lenders, which includes both NBFCs as well as small finance corporations, small finance banks, what they need to do is, she's saying that get deposits. Instead of lending out, get deposits, give them good interest rates, and then make good money out of it as well. So her message being that India's growth will eventually depend on banks lending comfortably to people who want to actually set up units and grow them. Is she referring again to banks really looking at the MSME sector to lend out to? Because that was a sector that was actually under stress by way of ballooning NPAs at banks. Now, she's coming out and saying that banks should look at getting deposits, pay higher interest rates, so getting people to save, not spend, which seems a little contrarian given that consumption drives economic growth. Then she's saying that lend out to institutions that contribute, perhaps, I'm paraphrasing, to nation building by creating jobs, by redeploying that money into capital development.
I read it as two different sets of notions. One is the individual and the other is the institution, whether it's a business entity or it's an enterprise of medium scale. Already there are parallel data in the environment which says that funding to both MSMEs and the individuals at the entry level that we discussed and defined just now is fairly well balanced. So deposits is a good idea. That will give a better profile of who the consumer is. For the MSME sector, I think this particular focus right now should be purely on the individual, who is seeking the loan. Building a greater ecosystem which has far greater checks and balances, and also drawing the balance so that the consumption story is not thwarted. And at the societal level, as I said, this fast-tracking your quest and the fine line between aspiration and ambition that has to be drawn. And for that, both RBI and FM can do as much, but the society at large has to do. You remember, Karthik, we all have taken pride, at times critiqued, rightly or wrongly, the savings mentality that we have inherited from our generation to generation. We can't shed it immediately at the at the attraction or the allure of that big ticket, being the number one in terms of buying the first phone, iPhone, or the first SUV car. I think there is need to halt or go a little slow.
Slow down.
Slow down, I think, to
That's
ensure
what,
that.
in fact, that's what Nirmala Sitharaman is also saying, to quote her, don't go too far too fast, so take it easy.
Yeah, if you don't want to slow down the economy, you slow down a bit in your quest for your individual aspirations.
Yeah, well, not sure if that is actually going to be in sync with overall the economic growth ambitions that we have, given that we are a consumption-driven economy. But let's move on. Let's move on for now and move on to another story that has actually been making headlines. And I'm talking about artificial intelligence in general and specifically about deepfake. And I think it's now come to light and a greater understanding has now been arrived at that deepfakes and their proliferation is not limited to celebrities and influencers alone, but could become a threat to democracy. And that's exactly what IT Minister Ashwani Vaishnaw has said. And towards the end of last week, the minister also went ahead and identified 4 pillars, suggesting also that within 10 days, some sort of a formal framework on attacking deepfakes will be built upon. Let's listen in to what Ashwani Vaishnaw had to say before we continue with our discussion.
Structured way, we'll work on, first pillar is detection. Detection of deepfakes, detection of deep misinformation. Second pillar is how to prevent the spread of deepfakes, deep misinformation that is detected and informed. Third is how to strengthen the reporting mechanisms. As all of you are aware, the in-app reporting mechanisms are there in most of the apps. How do we strengthen that so that the grievance appellate mechanism that also within the company and outside the company can be further strengthened? The fourth pillar that we have agreed on today is about awareness.
All right, so 4 pillars pretty much drawn out sequentially, but I want to actually talk about the detection part in greater detail with you, Rakesh, and then we can touch upon the rest of them as well. I think the detection part becomes critical at the platform level itself, because I believe once you upload any sort of content in the audio-visual medium, there is some sort of a digital footprint which is left behind. And there are technologies which generate artificially created content, including deepfakes and any other technology of that kind. And that digital footprint would have simple issues like codecs, which would be used to encode that particular piece of content, whether it is audio, whether it is image, whether it is video, any other format, right? So at a platform level itself, how difficult is it for the social media platforms, which are pretty much, the tools and the playground on which this content goes viral, to at source detect it? And even if it is a borderline case of perhaps fake, perhaps real, just thwart its circulation until another set of eyes or ears, as the case may be, is able to manually or using more advanced technologies detect whether it should be allowed to spread or not.
Karthik, first and foremost, it's a happy coincidence that after the Prime Minister talked about it at the Diwali Milan party with the media faculty, that we're talking about AI. And you would have noticed that Ashwani Vaishnaw and now, the entire government is focused on identifying a remedy for deepfakes.
Yeah.
But the issue, deepfake is the front end of it. The back end is very, very important, as you rightly pointed out.
Right.
Personally, I feel 10 days is too short a time to look at a solution. It's a global problem. Deepfakes is a global problem. If it was so easy to draw a solution by bringing in the social media players in one room, which is a good intent, good noble idea, but getting it to a solution in 10 days is going to be easier said than done.
Okay.
I am happy with the intent. I think we should celebrate the intent. But then there are global players, there are global technologies, and there are global, adversaries. So when they all at play at the same time, the problem becomes very complex.
Absolutely.
And it's an enormous challenge. Is it easy for social media platforms to look and identify the digital footprint and act? Social media platforms' core KRA, to my mind, is their propagators. They are platforms.
Correct.
It is not their core, agency to look and start enforcing someone who is coming there and creating a barrier for him or her.
But Rakesh, there are these checks and balances already in place. For example, pirated content. Right. Copyright infringement through audio,
Karthik,
music,
it took so
etc.
many
is
years.
detected.
It took so many years for leading players like Google to come to the conclusion.
I'm saying they have the technology. Now they have the technology,
It's a
and it's
question
not a
of
new technology being built. It is one thing, another layer of tech to be added, and these are tech giants who have the wherewithal, who have the
let me just put it in
engineering
context.
Yeah.
Right at the ministers' meeting, what came out sufficiently and succinctly was that is there need for a new legislation in terms of penalty? Fine. Who should do it? Who is responsible? But then what is the deterrent? There has to be a deterrent from a policy framework and from a societal framework also. When the deterrent is, there is something called safe harbor zone in which all these tech players, global players operate.
That's right.
Now, will this legislation be part of that or will be outside of that?
So what
experience of that,
MOSIT Rajiv Chandrasekhar had said, he had said that in the case of AI, the safe harbor clause will not be applicable. And he had very clearly said that there are other checks and balances that will come into place, but platforms cannot use the safe harbor clause to absolve themselves of the responsibility of
Karthik,
deepfake content
my
going viral on their
understanding,
platforms.
the latest understanding that I have, I'm happy to be corrected, is that that's not the case now. The Ashwani Vaishnaw has said that we are still open to examine whether we want to put it in that framework or we want to have an independent regulation for this.
Right. So is it going to be, that's what, so is it more likely to be, we don't know what it's going to be, is it more likely to be some sort of an amendment to the existing IT Act? Because I think the Digital India Bill, then the Act, all of that converting into law is going to be a much longer process than making maybe a small amendment or a significant amendment to the existing Act.
Even that wouldn't happen in 10 days. I'm coming back to my point.
Yeah.
It's still a deliberation stage. As I said, deepfakes, who is responsible? How do we stop that from happening? 10 days is too small a framework. And whether it's an amendment to the current law, which again, despite the law, if this has happened, despite the safe harbor zone, we have seen that how we are unable as an independent nation to rein in certain provisions which are not applicable and in the interest of the citizen, whether it's ethics, whether it's privacy. So now what should happen is, I think the last piece that the minister talked about is awareness. We are straight away heading into elections, which is one of the most watched globally events. And I think waiting for a legislation to have teeth and then bite is a little ambitious at this stage. I think the government and all stakeholders, including the social media players who are deeply invested into this idea, their reputation is at stake. With a popular prime minister of a country mentioning himself that there is a deep fake about him, then we have some popular stars in the entertainment domain. And I don't know, we didn't even know that there's a deep fake operating for you or for me. I'm more worried about you wouldn't even know that there's a deep fake for you. So in that sense, it's a Godzilla. Who controls it? How does it get controlled? We don't have easy answers to that. At the core of it again, Karthik, is when you mention AI, AI has to look at it, I'm for AI, but the best of AI has to man it in a manner that the worst of AI is mutilated, is mitigated.
Which is what I think is that fine line, or perhaps not a fine line anymore, a fairly thick line between regulation and innovation.
No, on regulation again, Karthik, there is a light touch regulation, there is a heavy handed regulation. I think India should take the best of the two. We should not be seen a nation which is, striking at the root of the democratic institution that social media platforms or technology brings with it. When it's a threat to democracy, we cannot endanger technology as a lever. We should use technology as a lever. So I think the first and the foremost thing is, ahead of elections, these very platforms should be empowered, there should be an enforcement of that framework, that education, elections are up, please be careful at each and every level. India is considered to be one of the biggest nations when it comes to like Facebook. I think we have the most populous Facebook numbers. Similarly, for all other social media giants, that's where I think the enforcement has to take place, and the government is keeping a close watch. That's welcome. Three things, I think there are three I's involved: the individual, the institution, and innovation. This is the axis that needs to be carefully manned. We have seen in the AI case at the top companies, the individual becoming the institution. And that individual is the institution because he's at the center of innovation. But all that should lead to some AI for good. AI for good, that's the key word.
So AI for good. I just want to end this discussion with asking you just one more question. And that question is that 60% of the world is going to go for elections, will be voting in 2024. The Economist, in its risk outlook for 2024, had actually put one of the risk areas as the public, by and large, losing faith in governments by the emergence of artificial intelligence. Do you see that really being a defining risk now, a high probability risk, as 60% of the world goes into elections?
I don't know how it's going to pan out, but it's a serious threat. But if there's any learning from earlier elections, 2014, social media had a role, digital had a role
Yeah.
in shaping up public opinion,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
shaping up narratives.
Yeah.
2019, social media platforms
Of
within
course,
the digital
of
framework
course,
had a great
Facebook
role. Yeah,
and,
so now
Cambridge.
2024,
Yeah.
2024, in India itself I'm talking about, deepfakes, how important or how divisive they can get, one really doesn't have a handle.
Right.
One can only hope and pray that we are able to cap it at the level of the government and at the level of the platforms, that they are able to keep an eye on it. But it's easier said than done, even at the level of the platforms.
Easier said than done is the word coming this weekend from Rakesh Khan. Not a very easy one at that. But let's move on to the next story that I think really requires some detailing and some discussion. And I'm talking about Go First, which has been grounded since May 2nd, 2023 this year. And many months later, no resolution in sight. The only company that expressed an interest to bid for the beleaguered airline was Jindal Power, but on the deadline of 21st November, last Tuesday, even Jindal Power did not submit a bid. What happened there on? The resolution professional Shailendra Ajmera knocked back on the doors of NCLT. NCLT has now given the RP another 90 days, 4th of February, for some sort of a resolution to be arrived at. Rakesh, 90 more days, pretty much an airline that has been on the ventilator. The Committee of Creditors led by IDBI Bank, Bank of Baroda, Deutsche Bank, Central Bank of India, none of them now seemingly willing to infuse any fresh funds into the airline. We don't have a bidder. Only one qualified EOI, which also refused to bid, which is Jindal Power. 90 days, any sort of resolution that you see coming through?
Karthik, I'm an eternal optimist, but in this case, I would love to, stick my neck out and say that enough is enough. Goodbye, go here. We're very sorry for you, but I think there is need to start afresh. All invested stakeholders must remember that Indian aviation market is built to be the third largest aviation market.
Yeah.
It cannot happen that we have just two big players and they, run the system in a manner that is, positive for them and not always positive for the entire ecosystem, which includes the passenger at the forefront of it.
Okay.
To sustain that growth and probably lead even further the aviation agenda globally, the civil aviation passenger agenda, I think Government of India must take the first step, must try and build that confidence like it did with Air India finally privatizing it and seek. We have so many big ticket private players. We have listed companies. I don't think Jindal Steel in this Jindal Power in this framework would have found it attractive enough to invest in Go Air.
Okay.
So, I think.
But then why do you think the RP is seeking another 90 days? If liquidation was the only obvious option, I mean, you're not being very optimistic. Perhaps we can give a little bit of optimism on his part. But apart from optimism, what else can be done in these 90 days? Because if liquidation was the way out, why go back to NCLT and ask for an extension of 90 days?
I think every day when the planes are grounded, when the staff has no clarity about what is going to happen to them, and that entire entity from a sociological perspective, from a business perspective, has no future. 90 days could be well a part of the procedure. It's like ticking all the boxes, not in this case the right boxes.
Right.
So, I mean, one can hope and say that prolonged for 90 days. I don't see anyone coming suddenly and appearing from somewhere saying that, oh, I'm invested in Go Air, I'm sticking my neck out, I'm putting this amount of money and try and resurrect this airline. Rather than that anyone who has the capital and has interest in this sector and sees the future that I just outlined. India is really destined to be one of the biggest aviation markets. Look at the order book of our other two players.
Of course.
It is an imperative that we host a couple of more big ticket players. I'm a little surprised that one of our traditional brick and mortar companies who are doing so well should have not invested yet in the aviation sector. Because if there is a P&L for any sector going forward, aviation is obviously on the top cart.
But Rakesh, who will see value in an aviation sector where there are two very, very dominant players, very difficult to challenge for their own reasons? One with the might of the Tata group behind it, and the other continuing to command 60% of market share, being Indigo, and a profitable airline with a large aircraft order that you mentioned, and both Tata group as well as which has AirAsia, Air India, Vistara, and now even Air India Express, like pretty much 4 airlines operating out of one big network. And then you've got Indigo together commanding about 80% plus of 85% plus of market share. And one after another, airlines going down. Right. Kingfisher, Jet Airways,
right,
now
from
go
East West
first.
Airlines.
I mean, of course, you've seen much earlier airlines as well. But who will want to invest in this sector?
Well, there's a learning. I'm not mentioning the company, but I'm mentioning the trend. Look at the telecom market. It was also dominated by 2 or 3 big players.
Continues to be the case. There is Jio, there is Airtel. No, but my larger question is, does rule of 3 now give way to rule of 2? Should we accept the fact that there are going to be just 2 dominant players in any industry, and let's live in a world of duopoly where together they can command any rates they feel right?
Well, the perks of that are obviously, there for the companies, but the perils of that are far more enormous. Somehow, who will bail the cat? I think as the deepest, invested stakeholder, it is the government.
Because the government is not going to again get into the business of running business and an airline.
I didn't mean running an airline. Yeah. There are endless conversations that the government at the highest level is having, with the industry leaders, whether at the forum of CII, FICCI, or multilateral agreements. They are invited for the India growth story, and there is no dearth of, so to say, each industrialist saying that I'm going to do it for the economic growth of this country. So somewhere down the line, I think if they feel that the aviation story has to survive beyond 2 big players, which is to the detriment of the consumer or the flying passenger, it may be good for their top line or bottom line, then that intervention has to take place.
All right, so some intervention has to take place is the final word coming here from Rakesh Khar. Well, with that, we've completely run out of time on this weekend edition of Business Plus. Rakesh, always a pleasure having you with us. And with that, we come to an end of this show. Thanks very much indeed for watching. And news, of course, continues right here on News9 Live.